Before we begin, settle into a comfortable position, let your shoulders relax, and allow the sounds around you to fade gently into the background. Tonight, we're traveling back to the summer of 1969, to a quiet corner of rural New York where green hills rolled gently beneath wide blue skies, dairy cows wandered peaceful pastures, and the biggest concern for many local farmers was whether the coming week would bring enough sunshine to dry freshly cut hay. It was a landscape that had changed only gradually over generations, a place where mornings began with the lowing of cattle, afternoons drifted by with the hum of cicadas, and evenings settled softly over weathered red barns and white wooden fences. It would have been nearly impossible for anyone standing in those fields to imagine what was about to happen. Within just a few days, these quiet hills would welcome nearly 500,000 people. Roads would fill with cars stretching for miles. Young travelers carrying backpacks, sleeping bags, guitars, and dreams would slowly make their way toward a dairy farm owned by a man named Max Yaska. Helicopters would buzz overhead. Music would drift across the valleys for miles. Rain would turn grassy hillsides into muddy slopes, yet laughter and songs would continue long into the night. For 3 remarkable days in August, a temporary city would appear almost as suddenly as a summer thunderstorm, and then, almost as quickly, it would disappear again. Today, when many people hear the word Woodstock, they immediately think of legendary musicians, iconic performances, colorful photographs, or perhaps images of enormous crowds standing together beneath gray skies. Over the decades, Woodstock has become more than simply a music festival. It has become a symbol of peace, of youth, of hope, of idealism, and of a generation searching for something different. Yet the real story is often quieter than the legend. Behind every famous photograph were ordinary people, college students who had never attended such a gathering before, farmers wondering what all the traffic was about, volunteers serving sandwiches, doctors treating blisters and sunburns, local residents offering directions to strangers, young couples watching sunsets from blankets spread across rolling hills, musicians nervously waiting backstage, construction workers racing to finish a stage before thousands of unexpected guests arrived. The festival was not carefully choreographed. It was imperfect, unpredictable, and at times wonderfully chaotic. Plans changed almost by the hour. Weather refused to cooperate. Attendance far exceeded every expectation. Yet despite countless obstacles, something remarkable unfolded, not because everything went according to plan, but because so many people chose patience, cooperation, and kindness in the face of uncertainty. That spirit, perhaps more than any single performance, is what continues to fascinate historians more than half a century later. As we journey through this story together, we'll take our time. Rather than rushing from one famous concert to another, we'll slow down and wander through the broader landscape that made Woodstock possible. We'll explore the America of the late 1960s, a nation experiencing enormous cultural change. We'll meet the 4 young men whose ambitious idea somehow grew into one of history's most famous gatherings. We'll spend quiet moments on Max Yaska's dairy farm before the crowds arrived, listening to birdsong and imagining the peaceful countryside that had existed there for decades. We'll travel the highways alongside thousands of hopeful festival-goers making their slow journey toward Bethel, New York. We'll watch workers build stages, install fences, and prepare for an event that no one quite realized would become historic. We'll experience gentle summer mornings, unexpected rainstorms, muddy hillsides, shared meals, quiet conversations between strangers, and music drifting softly through warm August air. Along the way, we'll also discover that Woodstock was never simply about famous performers. It was about timing, about community, about a brief moment when hundreds of thousands of people found themselves sharing the same space under open skies, creating memories that would remain vivid for the rest of their lives. History often focuses on great battles, political speeches, or dramatic turning points. But sometimes history is made through ordinary moments, through neighbors helping neighbors, through strangers sharing food, through friends sitting together on a hillside watching the sun disappear beyond distant trees, through conversations that begin with simple introductions and become lifelong memories. Those quieter moments are often the easiest to overlook, yet they may be the ones that tell us the most about the people who lived through them. As this story unfolds, imagine yourself not as a spectator standing far away, but as a gentle traveler moving slowly through time. Picture the winding country roads lined with stone walls and maple trees. Hear the distant sounds of crickets as evening approaches. Feel the warm August breeze carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and damp earth after a passing rainstorm. Watch clouds drift lazily across wide summer skies above the Catskill Mountains. There is no need to hurry. The story of Woodstock rewards patience. Like the slow turning of seasons on a family farm, its meaning becomes clearer the longer we spend with it. So dim the lights if you haven't already. Settle comfortably beneath your blankets. Allow your breathing to slow as we leave behind the noise of the present day and journey back to an American summer that has never quite faded from memory. Our story begins several years before the first guitar chord echoed across Max Yaska's fields, before the crowds, before the mud, before the music became legend. It begins with a changing nation, a restless generation, and a quiet countryside that, for one unforgettable weekend, became the center of the world. Long before the first notes of music drifted across Max Yaska's farm in August of 1969, America was already changing in ways both large and small. The transformation was happening in busy cities and quiet suburbs, on college campuses and family farms, inside classrooms, coffee shops, churches, and living rooms. It was a period when old traditions still held great importance, yet new ideas seemed to arrive almost every day. To understand Woodstock, we must first understand the country that created it. Imagine waking up on an ordinary weekday morning in the mid-1960s. The smell of fresh coffee drifts through the kitchen while a radio quietly plays the morning news. Children prepare for school, carefully combing their hair before climbing aboard bright yellow buses. Fathers button white shirts and straighten narrow neckties before driving to work in polished sedans. Mothers, although increasingly entering the workforce, often managed busy households filled with laundry, grocery lists, and neighborhood gatherings. In many ways, life appeared predictable. New neighborhoods continued spreading outward from American cities. Streets lined with nearly identical homes offered neatly trimmed lawns, young maple trees, and freshly poured sidewalks. Backyard barbecues became weekend traditions. Families gathered around black and white televisions before gradually replacing them with color sets that brought the world into their living rooms with surprising clarity. America had experienced remarkable economic growth following the Second World War. Factories produced automobiles, washing machines, refrigerators, and televisions at an astonishing pace. Millions of families who had once struggled during the Great Depression now enjoyed comforts that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Owning a home became a common dream. So did owning 2 cars. Vacations became more frequent as families packed station wagons and traveled newly completed interstate highways. National parks welcomed visitors from every corner of the country. Motels with brightly glowing signs appeared along popular routes, offering swimming pools, ice machines, and postcard racks in their front offices. It was an era filled with optimism. Yet beneath that optimism, another story was quietly unfolding. A generation unlike any before it was coming of age. These were the baby boomers, children born after World War II, whose numbers were so large that schools expanded classrooms almost every year to keep pace. By the mid to late 1960s, millions of these young Americans were graduating from high school, enrolling in colleges, finding jobs, questioning authority, and imagining futures that often looked quite different from those of their parents. Universities grew rapidly. College campuses became places not only for education but for conversation, debate, and discovery. Students encountered classmates from different backgrounds, different regions, and different ways of thinking. They read new books, listened to unfamiliar music, and discussed ideas late into the evening while sitting cross-legged on dormitory floors or beneath large shade trees. Many began asking difficult questions. What kind of country should America become? What responsibilities did citizens have during times of conflict? Could society become more peaceful, more equal, more compassionate? These conversations were rarely simple. At the same time, the civil rights movement continued reshaping the nation. Across the South and throughout the country, courageous individuals challenged segregation and unequal treatment under the law. Peaceful marches, community organizing, voter registration drives, and powerful speeches encouraged Americans to examine long-standing injustices. Television brought these events directly into family living rooms. For perhaps the first time, millions of people watched history unfold almost as it happened. Images that once might have remained local stories now became national conversations. Meanwhile, another conflict captured increasing attention. Across the Pacific Ocean, American involvement in Vietnam steadily expanded. What had begun with limited military advisors eventually grew into a lengthy and deeply divisive war. Thousands of young Americans received draft notices in the mail, informing them that military service awaited. Families gathered around dinner tables discussing uncertain futures. Parents worried. Young adults wondered what lay ahead. Newspaper headlines carried updates from distant jungles that suddenly felt much closer to home. As the years passed, public opinion became increasingly divided. Some believed the war was necessary, while others questioned its purpose and cost. Peaceful protests appeared in cities and on college campuses, where students carried handmade signs, sang folk songs, and hoped their voices might influence national policy. Music itself became part of these conversations. Throughout the early 1960s, folk musicians had been writing thoughtful songs about everyday people, justice, hope, and peace. Acoustic guitars were easy to carry and inexpensive to own. Friends gathered in parks, apartments, coffee houses, and college dormitories, singing together long after sunset. Soon, folk music blended with rock and blues, creating entirely new sounds. Bands experimented freely. Electric guitars became louder. Lyrics became more thoughtful and sometimes more mysterious. Albums were increasingly designed as complete artistic experiences rather than simply collections of popular songs. Listening to music became something people did with full attention. Friends would gather around record players, carefully place a vinyl album on the turntable, gently lower the needle, and sit quietly while listening from beginning to end. Album covers were studied almost as carefully as the music itself, their artwork inviting curiosity and imagination. At the same time, many young Americans were exploring new ways of living. Some left crowded cities for rural communities where they hoped to build simpler lives closer to nature. Others formed communal households, sharing food, chores, gardens, and responsibilities. Brightly colored handmade clothing, long hair, natural fabrics, and handcrafted jewelry became symbols of a growing counterculture that valued creativity, peace, and personal freedom over material success. To many outside observers, these young people appeared unconventional. To those participating, however, they were simply searching for lives that felt more authentic. It was not one unified movement. Some cared deeply about ending war. Others focused on environmental conservation, long before the topic became widely discussed. Some explored meditation, art, literature, or alternative lifestyles. Others simply enjoyed music festivals, camping outdoors, and meeting people from different walks of life. The common thread was curiosity. Many believed that kindness, creativity, and cooperation could build a better future. The famous Summer of Love in 1967 had already introduced much of the country to this emerging youth culture. Thousands traveled to neighborhoods like San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury, where music, art, and experimentation flourished. Although the moment was relatively brief, its influence spread through magazines, newspapers, television broadcasts, and conversations across America. By 1969, the ideas born during those years had traveled far beyond California. Young people in New York, Chicago, Seattle, Boston, Nashville, and countless smaller towns found themselves connected by music, shared hopes, and a growing belief that gathering together could create something meaningful. Yet no one imagined just how large one gathering would become. Far away from busy cities, the quiet hills of upstate New York remained much as they had for generations. Dairy farmers rose before sunrise to milk their cows. Hay fields ripened beneath the summer sun. Gravel roads wound gently through forests and rolling pastures, where life followed rhythms far older than politics or popular music. It was here, in this peaceful countryside, that two very different Americas would soon meet. One rooted in generations of farming tradition, the other carried by hundreds of thousands of young travelers searching for music, friendship, and perhaps a glimpse of a more hopeful future. Neither could fully imagine what the coming summer would bring, but together they were about to create one of the most memorable weekends in modern history. As the 1960s moved toward their final years, music was becoming bigger than ever before. Records sold in astonishing numbers. Concert halls filled night after night. New bands seemed to emerge every month, bringing fresh sounds and new ideas to eager audiences. Radio stations competed to play the latest hits, while record stores displayed colorful album covers in their front windows. For many young Americans, music was no longer simply entertainment. It had become part of daily life. A favorite song might accompany a long drive through the countryside. A newly purchased album might be shared among friends gathered on a living room floor. Concert tickets were treasured possessions tucked safely into wallets and jacket pockets. As audiences grew larger and musicians became more popular, a new generation of entrepreneurs began looking for opportunities within the rapidly expanding music industry. Among them were four young men whose paths would eventually cross in a way none of them could have predicted. Their names were Michael Lang, Artie Kornfeld, John Roberts, and Joel Rosenman. At first glance, they seemed like an unlikely team. Michael Lang was perhaps the most closely connected to the emerging counterculture movement. Born in Brooklyn and raised in New York, he had already gained experience organizing music events. He possessed a relaxed personality and a willingness to think creatively. Long-haired and soft-spoken, he understood the growing youth culture better than many traditional businessmen. Artie Kornfeld came from a different corner of the music world. He was already established within the recording industry, working as a songwriter, producer, and music executive. He knew artists, record labels, and the business side of popular music. While he appreciated creativity, he also understood the practical realities required to make ambitious projects succeed. John Roberts and Joel Rosenman offered yet another perspective. The two had met through business ventures and shared an interest in entrepreneurship. Roberts, whose family had considerable financial resources, possessed the ability to help fund large projects. Rosenman was thoughtful, curious, and interested in exploring unusual opportunities. Together, they formed an unexpected combination of dreamers, planners, artists, and businessmen. Yet none of them initially set out to create the most famous music festival in history. In fact, the earliest idea was something quite different. The group first discussed building a recording studio near the small town of Woodstock, New York. Woodstock had already become known as a gathering place for artists, writers, musicians, and creative thinkers. Nestled among the Catskill Mountains, the town offered beautiful scenery, quiet surroundings, and a peaceful atmosphere that attracted creative individuals seeking inspiration. Several notable musicians either lived there or spent time in the area. To many people in the music business, Woodstock seemed like the perfect location for a recording studio where artists could work away from the distractions of large cities. The idea appeared promising. Musicians could record albums surrounded by forests, hills, and fresh mountain air. Visitors might come and go quietly, enjoying the area's natural beauty while creating music. But as discussions continued, another possibility began to emerge. What if they organized a music festival as part of the project? Large outdoor music events had become increasingly popular during the late 1960s. Thousands of young people enjoyed gathering outdoors to hear live performances. Music festivals offered something different from traditional concerts. They felt communal, informal, and adventurous. Instead of spending a few hours inside an auditorium, attendees could spend entire days outdoors listening to music beneath open skies. The more the organizers considered the idea, the more appealing it became. A festival could help raise awareness for the recording studio project. It could attract musicians and fans alike. And perhaps, if everything went well, it might even turn a profit. At the time, their expectations were surprisingly modest compared to what would eventually occur. They imagined a successful event drawing tens of thousands of people, perhaps 50,000, maybe even 100,000 if they were fortunate. Those numbers alone would have represented a major achievement. No one was predicting nearly 500,000 attendees. As plans developed, the group spent countless hours discussing possibilities. Meetings took place in offices, restaurants, and private homes. Notebooks filled with calculations. Telephone calls stretched late into the evening. Maps were unfolded across tables. Budgets were drafted, revised, and revised again. The work was often far less glamorous than people might imagine. There were permits to consider, contracts to negotiate, insurance questions to answer, artists to contact, equipment to secure, food vendors to arrange, bathrooms to provide, parking plans to develop. Every solution seemed to generate 3 new problems requiring attention. Still, optimism remained high. The late 1960s often felt like a time when almost anything seemed possible. The space race was carrying astronauts toward the moon. New technologies appeared regularly. Popular culture evolved at breathtaking speed. Businesses launched ambitious ventures with confidence and enthusiasm. Why shouldn't a music festival succeed as well? As the months passed, the organizers continued refining their vision. Rather than simply presenting a series of concerts, they hoped to create an experience. They imagined a gathering where people could enjoy music, spend time outdoors, and share a sense of community. The event would celebrate creativity and bring together audiences from across the country. It was an ambitious goal, but not an unreasonable one. Many festivals before Woodstock had succeeded. This one simply hoped to be larger. One challenge quickly became clear, however. Finding musicians would require substantial effort. Fortunately, Artie Kornfeld's industry connections proved valuable. Popular performers were contacted. Booking agents negotiated schedules. Contracts were signed. Slowly, an impressive lineup began taking shape. Every confirmed artist increased excitement. Each new announcement attracted additional attention. Fans read about the planned festival in newspapers and music magazines. Word spread through college campuses and among groups of friends. Anticipation grew gradually but steadily. Meanwhile, another challenge remained unresolved. The festival still needed a home. Organizers searched for a location capable of accommodating large crowds while providing sufficient space for stages, parking areas, vendors, and camping. At first, the task seemed straightforward. Surely somewhere in upstate New York would welcome the opportunity. Yet finding the right location would prove far more difficult than anyone expected. Community concerns arose. Permits became complicated. Potential sites fell through. Deadlines approached. What had seemed simple on paper became increasingly stressful in reality. Still, the organizers pushed forward. They remained convinced the festival could happen. Perhaps not exactly as originally planned. Perhaps with a few compromises. But somehow, somewhere, the music would play. Looking back today, it is easy to imagine the founders confidently steering history toward its destination. The truth was far more ordinary. Most days they were simply trying to solve one problem after another. They worried about finances. They worried about schedules. They worried about logistics. And like anyone pursuing an ambitious dream, they often wondered whether everything would come together in time. Yet sometimes history begins exactly this way. Not through grand declarations or carefully crafted master plans, but through a handful of people pursuing an idea they believe might work. An idea that seems exciting. An idea that feels worth trying. An idea that, with enough effort and a little luck, might become something memorable. As spring turned toward summer in 1969, those 4 young organizers continued working tirelessly toward their goal. They still didn't know where the festival would be held. They still faced countless obstacles. But the dream remained alive. And somewhere among the rolling hills of New York, a dairy farmer named Max Yasker was going about his daily routine, completely unaware that his farm would soon become the answer to their greatest problem, and the setting for one of the most famous gatherings the world had ever seen. As plans for the festival slowly took shape during the spring of 1969, one important question remained unanswered. Where, exactly, would it all happen? Finding musicians was one challenge. Raising money was another. But finding a place large enough to welcome tens of thousands of visitors while remaining peaceful, accessible, and affordable proved to be one of the greatest obstacles of all. At first, the organizers focused their attention on the town of Woodstock, New York. It seemed like the obvious choice. Nestled among the gentle peaks of the Catskill Mountains, Woodstock had earned a reputation as an artistic community decades before the famous festival borrowed its name. Painters, writers, sculptors, and musicians had long been drawn to the area's quiet beauty. Winding roads led through forests of maple, oak, and pine. Small cafes and general stores welcomed both year-round residents and summer visitors escaping the heat of New York City. Despite its peaceful atmosphere, Woodstock itself simply didn't have enough open land for an event of the size the organizers envisioned. The search expanded. Maps were unfolded across office tables. Counties were studied. Potential sites were circled in pencil before being crossed out again. Some properties were too small. Others lacked proper road access. Some owners politely declined without much discussion. Others worried about the noise, the traffic, or the sheer number of expected visitors. The organizers soon found themselves driving countless miles through the rolling countryside of upstate New York. These were pleasant drives, even if they were often unsuccessful. Country roads curved gently between old stone walls built generations earlier by farmers clearing fields of rocks. White church steeples rose above sleepy villages where little seemed to change from one season to the next. Dairy farms dotted the landscape, their weathered barns standing faithfully through long winters and warm summers alike. In many places, time seemed to move at its own comfortable pace. Farmers rose before sunrise. Cows waited patiently in milking parlors. Fields of alfalfa and timothy grass swayed softly beneath the breeze. Tractors crawled methodically across hillsides, while children rode bicycles along quiet gravel roads. Few local residents paid much attention to the young businessmen occasionally driving through town. To them, these visitors were simply strangers asking unusual questions about large open fields. Eventually, the search led to the small village of Wallkill, New York. The location seemed promising. Permits were discussed. Plans advanced quickly. The organizers began believing they had finally found the right place. Workers started preparing for construction. Advertising continued. Tickets were printed. Musicians were booked. For a brief moment, everything appeared to be falling neatly into place. Then, unexpectedly, everything changed. As news of the proposed festival spread, many local residents grew concerned. Some worried about traffic overwhelming country roads. Others feared damage to farms and property. Still others questioned whether such a large gathering could be managed safely. Town meetings became increasingly crowded. Neighbors who had known one another for years found themselves discussing an event unlike anything their community had ever considered. Voices remained largely respectful, but opinions differed greatly. Some welcomed the opportunity. Others preferred preserving the quiet rhythm of rural life. Ultimately, local officials denied the necessary permits. Almost overnight, months of planning were thrown into uncertainty. The festival was only weeks away. Artists had committed to perform. Tickets had already been sold. Construction schedules left little room for delay. The organizers suddenly found themselves searching once again, this time with almost no time remaining. For many people, this might have marked the end of the project. But sometimes history depends upon a fortunate introduction. Around this critical moment, the organizers were connected with a dairy farmer named Max Yaska. Yaska owned more than 600 acres near the small town of Bethel, New York. Unlike many farms, his property included a naturally sloping hillside that gently descended toward a broad, open field. The shape of the land almost resembled a natural amphitheater, as though the countryside itself had quietly prepared a place where people could gather. It was beautiful. Rolling green grass stretched beneath wide summer skies. Wooded hills surrounded the fields. Small ponds reflected drifting clouds. Morning fog often lingered in the valleys before the rising sun slowly lifted it away. The farm itself was very much a working dairy operation. Long before sunrise each day, Max Yaska and his family followed routines that had changed little over the years. The cows needed milking whether rain was falling or sunshine filled the sky. Fences required repair. Machinery demanded maintenance. Hay had to be harvested before weather spoiled the crop. Life on a dairy farm was measured not by calendars but by seasons. Spring brought new calves. Summer filled the barns with fresh-cut hay. Autumn prepared everyone for winter. The work was steady, demanding, and deeply familiar. Max Yaska himself was known throughout the community as a hard-working and successful farmer. He valued independence and believed strongly in treating people fairly, even when they disagreed with him. When approached about hosting the festival, he listened carefully. The proposal was certainly unusual. Allowing tens of thousands of young strangers onto a working dairy farm was not something most farmers would eagerly consider. Yet Jaska saw the situation differently. He believed that people should have the freedom to gather peacefully. He also understood that his property possessed something increasingly difficult to find: enough open space for an ambitious dream. After thoughtful discussion, an agreement was reached. The festival would move to Bethel. The decision came only weeks before the scheduled opening. There was scarcely enough time to begin again. Construction crews quickly arrived. Surveyors measured fields. Engineers studied the hillsides. Bulldozers and trucks rolled across land that only days earlier had been occupied by grazing cattle. The peaceful farm remained beautiful, but now it carried a quiet sense of anticipation. Something extraordinary was about to happen. Neighbors watched with curiosity as equipment arrived one piece at a time. Telephone poles marked future utility lines. Wooden stakes appeared across fields. Temporary roads began taking shape. The familiar sounds of birds and tractors were gradually joined by the hammering of construction crews and the rumble of heavy machinery. Even then, few people imagined what was coming. The organizers still hoped for perhaps 50,000 visitors. That seemed like an enormous number. No one anticipated nearly 10 times that amount. For now, the hills remained mostly quiet. The summer breeze still moved gently through tall grasses. Barn swallows circled overhead. The evening sun cast long golden shadows across Jaska's fields, just as it always had. The farm waited patiently. Within a matter of weeks, those peaceful hills would become one of the most recognizable landscapes in modern history. But on these calm summer evenings before the crowds arrived, it was still simply a dairy farm in rural New York, a place where the rhythm of nature continued undisturbed, unaware that the world was slowly making its way toward its gates. Once Max Jaska agreed to host the festival, there was very little time to prepare. The calendar seemed to move faster with each passing day. Summer was already well underway, and thousands of tickets had been sold. What had only recently been an ordinary dairy farm now needed to become something entirely different, a temporary city capable of welcoming tens of thousands of visitors. It was an enormous task. Each morning, the quiet country roads leading to Jaska's farm grew busier. Pickup trucks, flatbed trailers, bulldozers, and construction crews arrived one after another. The peaceful sounds of birds and grazing cattle were joined by the steady rhythm of hammers, power saws, and diesel engines. The hillsides slowly began to change. The most important structure, of course, was the stage. Engineers selected a natural slope at the base of one of the rolling hills, allowing spectators to sit comfortably above the performers. It was almost as though nature had already designed an outdoor theater. The hillside would provide countless people with a clear view while helping the music travel across the valley. Carpenters worked from sunrise until evening. Large wooden beams were lifted into place. Platforms slowly rose above the grass. Electricians carefully installed miles of cable, ensuring microphones, amplifiers, and lighting would all function properly. Every connection had to be checked, because once the music began, there would be little opportunity to make repairs. Nearby, workers built towers for speakers capable of carrying sound across an audience, unlike anything most of them had ever imagined. At the time, outdoor concert technology was still developing. Producing clear sound for 50,000 people was already considered a difficult challenge. Fortunately, experienced sound engineer Bill Hanley and his team designed an innovative system that would become one of the festival's quiet triumphs. Elsewhere across the farm, another kind of construction was taking place. Portable toilets arrived by truck. Temporary water lines were installed. Medical tents were assembled. Food vendors claimed their assigned spaces. Workers measured parking areas across neighboring fields, carefully estimating how many automobiles they could accommodate. Maps were revised almost daily. Every completed task revealed 3 new ones waiting. Someone needed to arrange fencing. Someone else organized ticket booths. Volunteers discussed information stations where visitors could ask for directions or report lost belongings. The festival was becoming more complex with every passing hour. Despite all the careful planning, there remained a comforting sense that much of the event would simply unfold naturally. This reflected the spirit of the late 1960s. Many organizers believed that people, when treated with trust and respect, would largely take care of one another. While security personnel and medical staff were certainly important, there was also optimism that kindness and cooperation would accomplish what strict rules sometimes could not. For now, those ideas remained untested. The organizers still expected approximately 50,000 guests. That number seemed almost unimaginably large. To put it into perspective, many nearby towns had only a few thousand permanent residents. Hosting 50,000 visitors would already transform the countryside for an entire weekend. No one suspected the true number would be many times greater. As construction continued, local residents often drove past the property simply to observe the activity. Some watched with curiosity. Others remained skeptical. Children riding bicycles occasionally paused along country roads to watch cranes lifting heavy beams into place. Farmers passing on tractors slowed just enough to see how the project was progressing before returning to their own fields. Conversations at local diners often turned toward the upcoming festival. How many people do you think will actually come? Will they really sleep outside? Where will everyone park? No one had certain answers. Meanwhile, Max Yaska continued many of his regular farming duties. His dairy cows still required attention every morning and evening. Fields still needed mowing before the next rain. Fences still demanded occasional repairs. Even while construction transformed one section of his property, much of the farm continued operating as it always had. The contrast was remarkable. On one hillside, workers raised enormous speaker towers. On another, cows grazed peacefully beneath the summer sun. Nature and construction existed side by side. As August drew closer, the pace became even more urgent. Supplies arrived almost daily. Stacks of lumber disappeared as stages and platforms took shape. Telephone lines connected temporary offices. Generators waited quietly until they would finally be needed. Workers often stayed late into the evening, illuminated by portable floodlights as crickets began their nightly songs around them. Despite the long hours, there was excitement in the air. Each completed structure made the festival seem a little more real. Each passing day brought the opening weekend a little closer. Standing atop the hillside in those final days before the crowds arrived, one could still enjoy moments of remarkable peace. A warm breeze moved gently through the grass. Swallows swooped overhead in search of insects. The distant Catskill Mountains faded into a soft blue haze beneath the afternoon sun. Only the growing stage hinted that something extraordinary was about to happen. Soon, these empty fields would be covered with blankets, backpacks, tents, and hundreds of thousands of people. But for one last brief moment, Yaska's farm remained suspended between two worlds. It was no longer simply a quiet dairy farm. Yet it had not quite become Woodstock. That transformation would begin the moment the first travelers started arriving along the winding country roads, carrying with them sleeping bags, guitars, hopeful spirits, and expectations far greater than anyone could have imagined. As August of 1969 arrived, something remarkable began happening all across America. Thousands of people packed their belongings, climbed into cars, and pointed themselves toward a small farming community that many had never heard of before. They came from nearby cities and distant states, from college campuses and quiet suburbs, from bustling neighborhoods and sleepy country towns. Some traveled only a few hours. Others spent several days making their way toward the rolling hills of upstate New York. For many, the journey itself became part of the Woodstock experience. In those days, traveling across America felt different than it does today. There were no smartphones to provide directions, no digital maps recalculating the quickest route, and no social media updates revealing traffic conditions ahead. Instead, drivers unfolded large paper road maps across their steering wheels before setting off. Highway signs were carefully watched, and if someone became lost, they often stopped at a gas station or roadside diner to ask for directions. There was a slower rhythm to the road. Many festival-goers drove colorful Volkswagen microbuses, vehicles that had become symbols of freedom and adventure during the 1960s. Others traveled in station wagons packed with blankets, coolers, sleeping bags, and camping supplies. Some squeezed 6 or 7 friends into small sedans, sharing the cost of gasoline while taking turns behind the wheel. Not everyone owned a car. Thousands hitchhiked, standing patiently beside highways with handmade signs reading Woodstock. They waited for passing drivers who often happily offered them a ride. It was common for complete strangers to travel together for several hours, sharing stories, snacks, and excitement about the weekend ahead. Inside many vehicles, music filled the air. Portable radios played popular songs of the day, while cassette tapes and 8-track players entertained those fortunate enough to have them. Friends sang along as miles of highway rolled beneath their tires, imagining what the festival might be like. No one knew exactly what to expect. Some imagined a large outdoor concert. Others pictured something closer to a county fair or summer camp. Many simply hoped to spend a peaceful weekend surrounded by music and friendly people. As Wednesday turned into Thursday, the roads leading toward Bethel became noticeably busier. Traffic remained manageable at first. Cars wound comfortably through the Catskill Mountains, passing lakes that sparkled beneath the August sun and forests alive with birdsong. Small towns welcomed visitors with roadside cafes, family-owned motels, and general stores where travelers stopped to buy sandwiches, fruit, bottled drinks, and extra supplies. Local business owners noticed the growing number of unfamiliar license plates. Visitors arrived from Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, and countless other states. Some had decorated their vehicles with flowers or colorful painted designs. Others simply carried backpacks tied securely to their roofs. Everyone seemed to be moving in the same direction. Then the traffic began to slow. At first, it was hardly noticeable. Drivers waited through an extra traffic light or crawled behind a long line of cars climbing a steep country road. But with every passing hour, more vehicles joined the growing procession. Soon, movement nearly stopped altogether. Country roads that normally served quiet farming communities became filled bumper to bumper for mile after mile. Engines idled patiently. Windows rolled down as warm summer air drifted through the long rows of waiting automobiles. Some people grew tired of waiting. They parked alongside the road, gathered their belongings, and simply began walking. Sleeping bags were slung over shoulders. Backpacks bounced gently with each step. Acoustic guitars rested in worn cases carried by hopeful musicians who imagined joining impromptu sing-alongs once they arrived. The roads themselves became communities. Strangers greeted one another with friendly waves. Families shared cold drinks. Children stretched their legs in grassy ditches while parents chatted with people parked nearby. What might have become a frustrating traffic jam instead took on the atmosphere of an unusually long neighborhood gathering. Police officers directing traffic soon realized that conditions were unlike anything they had ever encountered. The number of arriving vehicles far exceeded every estimate. Roads designed for quiet rural life simply could not accommodate so many visitors at once. Helicopters occasionally flew overhead, carrying organizers and performers above the nearly motionless lines of traffic below. Meanwhile, local residents watched with quiet amazement. Farmers paused from their work to observe endless streams of automobiles creeping past their fields. Elderly couples sitting on front porches counted cars until they eventually gave up, realizing there seemed to be no end. For many people living nearby, it was the busiest their roads had ever been. Despite the delays, the mood remained surprisingly cheerful. People accepted that reaching the festival might take far longer than expected. There was little impatience. After all, they had nowhere else they wanted to be. The destination awaited patiently. As evening approached, the Catskill Mountains glowed with soft golden light. Long shadows stretched across fields of corn and hay while hundreds of travelers continued their slow journey on foot, laughing together as cicadas filled the warm summer air with their steady song. Some spent the night beside the road, too far from the festival to arrive before darkness. Others slept inside their cars with windows open to catch the cool evening breeze. In many ways, Woodstock had already begun. Not on the stage, not with music, but on the roads themselves, where thousands of strangers discovered that the journey could be just as memorable as the destination. With every passing hour, more people arrived. The organizers, watching the growing crowds, slowly realized something astonishing. The 50,000 guests they had carefully planned for were only the beginning. A gathering unlike anything America had ever seen was quietly unfolding, one car, one backpack, and one weary traveler at a time. By Thursday, August 14, 1969, it had become clear that the organizers were witnessing something far beyond anything they had planned. The roads remained crowded. The fields surrounding Max Yaska's farm continued to fill with people. Every hour brought another wave of travelers, many arriving on foot after leaving their cars miles away. They emerged over gentle hills carrying backpacks, rolled up sleeping bags, coolers, and folding blankets, smiling as they caught their first glimpse of the enormous stage waiting in the valley below. From the hillside, the scene looked almost peaceful. Small groups spread across the grass, choosing places to sit while others wandered slowly through the growing crowd. Friends reunited after long journeys, while strangers introduced themselves with easy conversations that often began with a simple question. "Where did you come from?" The answers came from nearly every corner of the country. As the hours passed, the organizers gathered to review the situation. Originally, the festival grounds had been enclosed by fences. Ticket booths had been built at the entrances, and staff members prepared to check admission passes as guests arrived. But those plans were quickly becoming impossible. The sheer number of people approaching the property overwhelmed every entrance. Long before everyone could purchase tickets or pass through the gates, thousands were already walking across neighboring fields and open spaces simply trying to reach the music. The fences, which had seemed so important only days before, no longer served their purpose. Some sections had already been damaged by the overwhelming crowds. Others were quietly bypassed altogether. It soon became obvious that maintaining a traditional ticketed event was no longer realistic. The organizers faced an extraordinary decision. Rather than attempting to stop the endless flow of visitors, they accepted the reality before them. The festival would continue. In effect, Woodstock became a free concert. It was not part of the original plan. It was simply the only practical choice. The decision carried enormous financial consequences, but at that moment, safety mattered more than ticket sales. Allowing people to enter calmly was far preferable to creating dangerous bottlenecks outside the grounds. Without anyone formally announcing it to the growing crowd, the atmosphere shifted. The barriers that had divided inside from outside seemed to disappear. The farm became an open gathering place. People continued arriving from every direction, spreading blankets across the rolling hillside and settling into what felt less like a commercial event and more like a temporary community. Looking across the valley, one could see a colorful patchwork forming on the grass. Bright sleeping bags, handmade quilts, canvas backpacks, wide-brimmed hats resting beside picnic baskets. Some visitors had brought folding chairs, while others simply stretched out on the hillside, enjoying the warm August afternoon. There was surprisingly little rushing. People wandered slowly, greeting one another with relaxed smiles. Some carried acoustic guitars and paused beneath trees to play familiar folk songs. Others shared fruit, sandwiches, or homemade cookies with neighbors they had met only moments before. The spirit of generosity appeared almost naturally. Volunteers began helping direct newcomers toward available camping areas. Medical personnel prepared for the steady stream of visitors needing water, sunscreen, or treatment for tired feet after walking many miles. Local residents occasionally arrived carrying extra supplies, curious to see the gathering that had suddenly transformed their quiet countryside. The organizers themselves barely had time to pause. They moved continuously between the stage, information tents, construction crews, and local officials, solving one problem after another as each arose. There were questions about food, questions about water, questions about parking, sanitation, and medical care. Every answer seemed temporary because the situation continued changing by the hour. Yet despite the enormous logistical challenges, something remarkable became increasingly apparent. The crowd remained unexpectedly calm. Certainly, there were inconveniences, long walks, crowded pathways, limited facilities. But instead of frustration, many people accepted these difficulties as simply part of the experience. Patience became one of the festival's quiet strengths. As afternoon drifted toward evening, the hillside continued filling until it resembled a vast human landscape stretching almost to the horizon. Those arriving late often stopped in amazement. Few had ever seen so many people gathered together in one place. From the stage, the audience appeared almost endless. Rows of faces blended into blankets, tents, and colorful clothing, disappearing into the distant hills beneath the soft summer sky. Meanwhile, Max Yaska occasionally looked across his farm with understandable astonishment. Only days earlier, dairy cows had grazed peacefully where hundreds of thousands of people now sat talking, laughing, and waiting for the music to begin. It was an extraordinary transformation. The familiar rhythms of farm life had given way to something entirely new. And yet, beyond the festival grounds, nature continued almost unchanged. Swallows still circled overhead. Gentle breezes moved through the tall grass beyond the crowd. The surrounding forests remained quiet, their trees standing as silent witnesses to the remarkable gathering unfolding below. As the sun slowly lowered toward the western hills, painting the sky with soft shades of gold and amber, anticipation settled gently across the valley. The long journey was finally over. The fences were gone. The crowd had become a community, and in just a little while, the first notes of music would drift across Max Yaska's farm, beginning one of the most memorable weekends in American history. By late afternoon on Friday, August 15, 1969, the long wait was finally coming to an end. Across the broad hillside of Max Yaska's farm, hundreds of thousands of people settled comfortably onto the grass. Some rested on colorful blankets spread across the gentle slope. Others leaned against backpacks or sat cross-legged with friends they had known for years, or strangers they had met only hours before. The excitement that had filled the roads during the long journey slowly transformed into something quieter. Now there was nowhere else to travel. The destination had been reached. The stage stood at the bottom of the natural amphitheater, framed by green hills and late summer trees. Above it stretched an endless blue sky, interrupted only occasionally by soft white clouds drifting lazily overhead. A warm breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass, wildflowers, and the nearby forests that surrounded the valley. Every so often, someone would glance toward the stage, wondering how much longer it would be before the first performer appeared. Despite months of planning, the festival did not begin exactly on schedule. The enormous traffic jams had delayed both concert-goers and musicians alike. Equipment arrived later than expected. Performers found themselves inching along crowded highways or being flown in by helicopter when the roads became impossible to navigate. The delays might have frustrated another audience. Instead, many people simply waited. Some chatted quietly. Others shared food with neighbors. Small circles formed where acoustic guitars appeared, and familiar folk songs drifted across the hillside long before the official performances began. Laughter rose and fell like a gentle breeze, never overwhelming the peaceful atmosphere that seemed to settle naturally over the crowd. Eventually, the moment everyone had been anticipating finally arrived. The festival opened with Richie Havens. His appearance came somewhat unexpectedly, as scheduling changes required him to perform first while other musicians were still trying to reach the festival grounds. Standing before an audience far larger than anyone had anticipated, Havens began playing with remarkable calm. His guitar echoed across the valley. The sound system, so carefully assembled during the previous weeks, carried every note up the hillside with surprising clarity. Conversations gradually faded as listeners turned their attention toward the stage. For many people, it was less like attending a concert and more like sharing an enormous outdoor gathering with music gently woven into the experience. The audience listened attentively. Some closed their eyes. Others swayed softly where they sat. As the afternoon sunshine warmed the hillside, the music seemed to become part of the landscape itself. Havens performed longer than originally planned because several scheduled artists had not yet arrived. Drawing upon his creativity, he improvised new verses and rhythms, eventually creating one of the festival's most memorable opening moments. Few people realized they were witnessing history. To them, it was simply beautiful music on a warm summer afternoon. As one performance ended, another gradually followed. Sweetwater brought a different musical style, blending folk, rock, and classical influences. Bert Sommer appeared with an acoustic guitar, his gentle songs floating peacefully across the gathering. Tim Hardin, Ravi Shankar, Melanie, Arlo Guthrie, and Joan Baez each added their own unique voice as daylight slowly gave way to evening. There was no rush. The performances unfolded at an unhurried pace, allowing the audience time to absorb each artist before welcoming the next. As the sun drifted lower in the western sky, the colors of the landscape began to change. Golden light spread across the hillside. Long shadows stretched through the crowd. The surrounding forests darkened slightly while the stage lights grew brighter, preparing for the arrival of night. Some people wandered quietly to food stands before returning with simple meals. Others filled water bottles or explored the growing network of tents and pathways that had appeared across the farm. The festival had begun to develop its own daily rhythm. Music, conversation, rest, then more music again. As darkness settled over the Catskills, thousands of tiny points of light appeared throughout the audience. Flashlights flickered. Lanterns glowed softly beside tents. Candles illuminated small circles of friends sharing stories beneath the stars. The The cool evening air offered welcome relief after the warmth of the afternoon. Wrapped in blankets or light jackets, many listeners continued watching the performances, while others simply gazed upward at the clear August sky. Far from the bright lights of large cities, the stars appeared wonderfully vivid. The Milky Way stretched faintly overhead. Crickets began their evening chorus from the surrounding fields. Somewhere beyond the crowd, dairy cows rested quietly in neighboring pastures, unaware that one of history's most famous music festivals was unfolding nearby. Backstage, musicians waited patiently for their turn. Some tuned guitars. Others sat quietly with cups of coffee, listening to the distant applause drifting through the night. There was an unusual feeling of togetherness among the performers, many of whom sensed that this gathering was unlike any concert they had experienced before. No one could yet know how often Woodstock would be remembered in the decades ahead. There were no commemorative posters declaring its importance. No historians taking careful notes. Only musicians making music, audiences listening beneath the stars, and a peaceful hillside temporarily transformed into a place where hundreds of thousands of people shared the same songs, the same evening breeze, and the same remarkable moment. As Friday night grew deeper and the final performances continued into the early hours of Saturday morning, the festival settled comfortably into its rhythm. The music had begun, and with it came the feeling that, despite every unexpected challenge, Woodstock had truly come to life. When the sun rose on Saturday morning, August 16th, it revealed a landscape unlike anything the organizers had imagined only a few days before. The hillside was now home to hundreds of thousands of people. Blankets covered the grassy slopes like colorful quilts. Small tents had appeared wherever there was room. Sleeping bags lay drying in the morning sunshine, while wisps of smoke rose from camp stoves preparing simple breakfasts. The air felt fresh. Morning dew clung to the grass, sparkling as sunlight slowly climbed above the eastern hills. Birds continued singing from the surrounding forests, seemingly unconcerned by the temporary city that had appeared almost overnight. Many people woke gradually. Some stretched sleepily before wandering in search of breakfast. Others sat quietly with cups of coffee, watching the valley slowly come alive around them. There was no rush. Without office buildings, school bells, or daily schedules, time seemed to move more gently than it did elsewhere in the world. Music resumed throughout the morning, and once again the hillside filled with listeners. But as the day continued, the weather began to change. Small white clouds gradually gathered overhead. At first, they provided welcome shade from the warm August sun. Then they became darker. A cool breeze swept across the valley, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of approaching rain. Leaves fluttered gently in the trees surrounding the farm, and people looked toward the sky with quiet curiosity. The first drops were scattered and light. A few people unfolded ponchos or covered backpacks with plastic sheets. Others simply smiled and continued listening. Summer showers were hardly unusual, but soon the rain became steadier. Within minutes, the gentle hillside began changing. The dry grass softened beneath thousands of footsteps. Footpaths turned slippery. Small puddles formed in low places, reflecting the grey sky above. As more rain fell, the earth could no longer absorb it quickly enough. The famous Woodstock mud began to appear. At first it gathered around heavily travelled walkways. Then it spread across the hillside itself, transforming firm ground into soft brown earth that clung to shoes and bare feet alike. Many people removed their sandals altogether, deciding it was easier simply to walk barefoot through the cool mud. What could have become an unpleasant inconvenience somehow became part of the shared adventure. Friends laughed as they helped one another climb slippery slopes. Neighbors offered dry blankets to those whose belongings had become soaked. Strangers held umbrellas over people they had only recently met. Everywhere, small acts of kindness unfolded almost unnoticed. Volunteers worked tirelessly throughout the changing weather. Medical tents welcomed anyone needing assistance. Food continued to be prepared despite the rain. Water stations remained busy as people refilled bottles and checked on one another. The organizers faced enormous challenges. Heavy rain complicated electrical equipment and stage preparations. Performances occasionally paused while crews carefully inspected cables and microphones, ensuring that musicians and audiences remained safe. Whenever the music stopped, patience filled the silence. No one seemed eager to complain. Instead, conversations continued beneath makeshift shelters assembled from tarps, blankets, and pieces of plastic stretched between poles or tied to nearby vehicles. The rain created a different rhythm. Instead of constant movement, people gathered together in small groups, telling stories while waiting for the skies to clear. Some shared snacks packed days earlier for the journey. Others passed around guitars, softly playing familiar songs while raindrops tapped gently overhead. The festival had become something larger than a concert. It had become a temporary village. Far above the muddy fields, helicopters flew steadily throughout the day. Originally intended to transport performers, they now carried medical supplies, food, and essential equipment into the festival grounds. With many roads nearly impassable because of traffic, the helicopters became an important connection between Woodstock and the outside world. Their steady whirring became another familiar sound floating through the valley. As afternoon slowly turned toward evening, the rain began easing. Clouds gradually drifted apart. Patches of blue sky returned. Warm sunshine filtered through the remaining mist, illuminating the hillside with a soft golden glow. Steam rose gently from the damp earth. Countless tiny droplets sparkled on blades of grass that had somehow remained standing despite the enormous crowd. The mud remained, of course. Shoes were coated. Blankets required cleaning. Many clothes would never quite look the same again. Yet remarkably few people seemed to mind. Looking across the hillside, one could see smiling faces everywhere. Children splashed through shallow puddles. Friends helped one another wash muddy hands in small streams of clean water. Laughter drifted across the fields as easily as the music itself. It was as though everyone understood they were sharing an experience that could never be perfectly planned. Nature had become another participant in the festival. The rain had reminded everyone that despite the towering speakers, elaborate stage, and enormous crowd, this gathering still belonged to the landscape around it. The hills, the trees, the changing sky, the soft earth beneath everyone's feet. As darkness slowly settled once more over Max Yaska's farm, lanterns flickered across the hillside, reflecting softly in puddles left by the afternoon storm. The air had cooled. Crickets resumed their evening chorus. Fresh, rain-washed breezes drifted gently through the valley, carrying the scent of wet grass and summer leaves. The music would continue long into the night. But perhaps the most lasting memory of that rainy Saturday was not the weather itself. It was the extraordinary patience of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who accepted discomfort with quiet smiles, shared what they had with strangers, and transformed muddy fields into a place remembered not for inconvenience, but for community. By Sunday morning, August 17, 1969, Woodstock had settled into a rhythm unlike anything its organizers had ever imagined. The music was still there, of course, rising and falling across the valley in steady waves. But between performances, there were long stretches of quiet life unfolding across Max Yaska's farm, small, ordinary moments that together formed something extraordinary. In many ways, the festival had become less like a scheduled event and more like a temporary town. People woke slowly in the morning light. There were no alarms, no work shifts, no school buses waiting at the curb. Just sunlight filtering through thin morning mist and the distant sound of someone tuning a guitar somewhere down the hillside. Some attendees began their day by simply sitting up in their sleeping bags and watching the world come back into focus. Others stretched, rubbed their eyes, and looked around as if remembering where they were. For a few seconds each morning, there was always that gentle moment of recognition. Oh, I'm still here. The hillside itself had become a shared living space. Paths formed naturally where people walked most often, winding between blankets, tents, and small clusters of friends. These informal walkways changed slightly each day as the crowd shifted and resettled like a slow-moving tide. Food was simple and unhurried. People shared what they had brought or what they could find from the long lines at vendor stands. Apples, bread, sandwiches, and fruit passed easily from hand to hand. Sometimes someone would sit down beside a stranger and quietly offer half of what they were eating without saying much at all. It felt natural. There was no need for explanation. Water stations remained steady points of gathering. People waited patiently in loose lines, chatting softly while filling bottles or cupping their hands beneath running taps. Conversations began easily here, often with nothing more than a smile or a comment about the weather. Long night. Yeah, but it was worth it. Beyond the immediate festival grounds, the surrounding fields continued to serve as overflow camping areas. Tents appeared wherever there was space, scattered across the landscape like small, temporary markers of human presence. Some people wandered these areas during the day, simply exploring. They followed footpaths through tall grass, crossed shallow creeks, and occasionally stopped to rest beneath trees offering patches of shade. The countryside itself felt unusually open, as though the usual boundaries between strangers had softened. Music drifted constantly in the background. Even when no official performance was happening, guitars appeared everywhere. Small groups formed spontaneously, someone playing a few chords, someone else humming along, others simply listening with their eyes closed. There was no pressure for perfection, no expectation of audience or applause, just sound shared in open air. At times, conversations became the main activity of the day. People told stories about how far they had traveled, how long it had taken to reach the farm, what they had seen along the way. Some spoke about college, about work they had left behind for the weekend, about uncertain plans for the future. Others spoke very little at all, preferring to simply listen. One of the most remarkable features of Woodstock was how easily strangers became temporary companions. A shared blanket on a hillside could turn into a circle of conversation that lasted hours. A short walk toward food stands might end with new friendships formed over shared directions or laughter at the muddy paths still left by Saturday's rain. Even small inconveniences became shared experiences. Getting stuck in mud became a group effort. Finding shade became a cooperative search. Waiting in line became a place to meet new people. Medical tents and volunteer stations also reflected this atmosphere. Nurses and doctors treated everything from exhaustion to minor injuries, but even here the tone remained calm. People waited their turn patiently, often chatting with others nearby as they recovered from long nights and long walks. Some simply needed rest. Others needed water. Others just needed a quiet place to sit for a while. Throughout the day, the weather shifted gently but remained kind. Clouds passed overhead without urgency. Sunlight returned in soft intervals, warming the hillside and drying some of the mud left from the previous day's rain. The landscape itself seemed to breathe slowly with the crowd. In the distance, Max Yaska's farm continued its ordinary work in quiet contrast. Cows grazed in nearby fields, unbothered by the gathering beyond the fence line. The rhythm of rural life continued just beyond the festival's edges, unchanged except for the presence of so many visitors nearby. That contrast felt almost surreal. One world of permanent routine, one world of temporary community, and between them, a hillside filled with people simply living day to day, hour to hour, moment to moment. As Sunday continued, there was a growing awareness that the festival would soon begin its final stretch. Some attendees already felt the slow pull of departure, while others remained fully immersed in the present, not yet thinking about the journey home. For now, there was still music, still conversation, still time, and beneath it all, the quiet realization that this unusual little town on a dairy farm had developed its own gentle way of life, one built not on schedules or structure, but on shared space, patience, and the simple act of being together. By Sunday afternoon, the hillside at Woodstock had already lived through a full cycle of weather, music, exhaustion, and quiet renewal. Yet in many ways, the festival was still unfolding for the first time. The crowd had grown used to the rhythm by now. Wait for music. Listen. Rest. Talk. Drift. Then slowly return again to the stage. What made Woodstock remarkable was not only its size, but the variety of sounds that filled the valley over those 3 days. Each performer brought something different, yet all of it seemed to blend into the same open-air atmosphere, carried gently by summer wind across the Catskills. There was no sense of competition, no urgency to impress, only the shared experience of music being played in a place where so many people had gathered simply to listen. Some artists leaned into the folk traditions that had shaped much of the decade. Their songs were quiet, reflective, and often centered on storytelling. A single voice and an acoustic guitar were enough to hold thousands of people in stillness. Others brought electric energy. Rock bands filled the air with amplified sound that rolled across the hills like distant thunder, yet still felt strangely intimate when heard under the open sky. Even at its loudest, the music never seemed to overpower the setting. Instead, it became part of it. The landscape itself seemed to participate. Gentle slopes carried sound downward toward the stage. Trees at the edges of the farm absorbed and softened echoes. The sky above remained wide and patient, as though giving space for every note to rise and fade at its own pace. Among the many performers, several moments would later become especially remembered, not because they were the loudest or most technically perfect, but because they seemed to match the feeling of the weekend itself. Richie Haven's opening performance had already set the tone, improvisational, unhurried, and shaped by circumstance as much as design. Joan Baez's songs brought a calm clarity, her voice rising gently over an audience that often fell completely silent while listening. Arlo Guthrie's storytelling carried a lighter tone, weaving humor and narrative together in a way that felt like sitting around a campfire with thousands of companions. The music was not separate from the environment. It was part of it. Even when crowds grew tired, or mud made movement difficult, or rain briefly returned to soften the hillside again, the performances continued to feel like a natural extension of the day. At times, the audience itself became part of the rhythm. Applause rolled across the valley in waves. Cheering rose and faded like wind moving through tall grass. And between songs, silence settled comfortably, never feeling empty or uncomfortable. One of the most memorable qualities of Woodstock's music was its pacing. There was no strict structure that forced the audience to hurry from one moment to the next. Sets often stretched longer than planned, while unexpected delays or arrivals created space for improvisation and patience. What might have felt disorganized elsewhere instead became part of the festival's identity. Time seemed to loosen its grip. Hours blended into one another. Afternoon softened into evening without clear boundaries. And through it all, music remained the quiet anchor holding everything together. Even the larger, louder performances carried a sense of openness. When electric instruments filled the air, They did not feel harsh or distant. Instead, they seemed to belong to the same landscape as the acoustic sets, just another voice in a larger conversation between people and place. By this point in the weekend, many attendees had stopped thinking of themselves as an audience in the traditional sense. They were participants in something shared. Listeners, yes, but also part of the atmosphere that made listening possible. Some closed their eyes and let the sound drift over them. Others watched the stage with relaxed attention, not focusing on individual songs so much as the feeling of continuity between them. The experience was less about individual performances and more about accumulation. Each artist added another layer to the memory of the weekend. Each song became part of a larger story that no one could fully recognize while it was happening. Only later would people try to describe it. Only later would they realize how unusual it had been. For now, it was simply music in a field. Music in the rain. Music at sunset. Music continuing late into the night while the stars slowly appeared above the Catskill Hills. And as Sunday moved quietly toward its final hours, the sense began to grow that something temporary and rare was slowly approaching its end. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently, like the fading echo of a final chord stretching out into the night air before finally disappearing into silence. By the time Monday, August 18th, 1969 arrived, Woodstock had begun to change again. The energy of the weekend had softened. Many attendees were asleep in tents or resting beneath blankets still damp from the previous day's rain. Others were already packing slowly, folding sleeping bags with the unhurried rhythm of people who were not eager to leave but understood that the moment was approaching its end. The hillside, which had been so densely filled just a day earlier, now felt slightly more open. Paths between blankets were easier to see. Some areas that had been crowded with hundreds of people now showed patches of grass again, pressed flat but visible beneath the footprints of the weekend. Morning light spread gently across Max Yaska's farm. It was softer than before, as though the land itself had grown tired along with the crowd. The air was cool. Quiet conversations drifted through the valley. A few remaining musical performances continued in the distance, but the pace of the festival had clearly slowed. There was no longer the sense of anticipation that had carried the earlier days forward. Instead, there was reflection, and rest, and a gradual awareness that something unforgettable had already taken place. By the time Jimi Hendrix took the stage that morning, many in the audience were still waking from a long night. Some had not slept at all. Others had drifted in and out of sleep beneath open skies as the festival stretched into its final hours. Hendrix's appearance had been delayed, like so many things that weekend, due to scheduling changes and the simple difficulty of moving through roads still congested with departing traffic. But when he finally stepped into view, there was a quiet shift across the hillside. People turned toward the stage. Slowly, naturally, without announcement or urgency. The crowd that remained was smaller than the peak on Saturday, but it was still vast, spread across the hills in a loose, peaceful arrangement of blankets, bodies, and tired eyes watching the morning unfold. The stage itself felt different in the early light. Not theatrical, not distant, more like a place where something personal was about to be shared. Hendrix and his band began to play. The sound was familiar in structure, but unlike anything the audience had experienced earlier in the weekend. Electric guitar tones stretched across the valley, bending and rising with a voice that felt both controlled and free at the same time. The music moved slowly at first, as if matching the unhurried pace of the morning. There was no rush from the performer, no urgency from the audience. It felt less like a closing act and more like a final conversation between music and landscape. As the set continued, the sky above the Catskills brightened further. Sunlight reached deeper into the valley, Shadows shortened across the hillside where thousands still sat quietly listening. Some people closed their eyes again, not to sleep this time, but to simply absorb the sound without distraction. Others watched the stage with calm attention, occasionally shifting positions in the grass as the morning grew warmer. The performance itself became something larger than its individual parts. Guitar lines echoed across the open air and faded into the surrounding hills. Drums rolled gently beneath the higher notes. And between phrases, there were moments of near silence where the natural sounds of the farm, wind, distant birds, rustling grass, seemed to become part of the composition. At times, it was difficult to tell where the music ended and the environment began. By now, Woodstock was no longer just a festival. It had become a memory in the making. Even those who were still present seemed aware, in a quiet way, that they were witnessing the final pages of something that would not repeat itself in the same form again. There were no formal announcements marking the end, no closing ceremony, no final speech from the stage. Instead, there was simply music continuing through the morning, while people gradually prepared to leave in their own time. Some packed slowly, others lingered a little longer, unwilling to rush away from the hillside that had held so much life for 3 days and nights. The farm itself looked different again. Muddy paths had begun to dry in places. Abandoned blankets and tents were gathered and folded. The crowds thinned in uneven waves, like water slowly retreating from a shoreline. And still, Hendrix's music carried across the valley, not as a climax, not as an ending shouted into the sky, but as something more gentle, a final sound drifting across a landscape that had briefly held 500,000 people and was now beginning to return, piece by piece, to quiet countryside. As the last notes faded into the morning air, there was a long, soft stillness over Yaska's farm, not empty, not silent in a sudden way, but calm, like the moment after a long storm has passed, when the world is still listening to itself before moving forward again. Woodstock was ending, but in a way, it was also becoming something else entirely, a story people would carry with them long after the hillside returned to grass and the music became memory. By Monday morning, as the last echoes of music faded into the hills, Woodstock had already begun its slow return to stillness. The change was not immediate. It unfolded gradually, like a tide pulling away from the shore. Where there had been dense crowds only hours before, there were now open patches of grass. Paths that had been filled with movement were quieter, softened by footprints pressed into the earth. The hillside still held the shape of the gathering, but the life within it was beginning to disperse. People left in small waves. Some departed early Monday morning, walking carefully through mud that had now hardened in uneven patterns. Others waited until later in the day, reluctant to leave the place that had defined their entire weekend. Cars that had been stuck for days along rural roads finally began to inch forward again, carrying tired passengers back toward ordinary life. The journey home felt different. There was less excitement now, but more reflection. Back at Max Yaska's farm, the work of dismantling and cleanup had already begun. What had taken weeks to build was now being carefully taken apart, piece by piece. Wooden platforms were disassembled. Temporary fencing was removed. Cables that had stretched across fields were coiled and packed away. Equipment that had once been rushed into place under pressure now left slowly and deliberately, as though the land itself required time to adjust. The transformation of the farm was striking. Only days earlier, it had been a temporary city filled with music, movement, and constant activity. Now it was becoming farmland again, though not quite yet. The traces of the weekend remained everywhere. Mud still covered much of the ground. Abandoned items were collected in piles. Lost belongings, blankets, sandals, jackets, and backpacks, were gathered by volunteers trying to return order to the scattered remnants of the crowd. Cleaning up after such a massive gathering was not a simple task. It required coordination, patience, and a large number of people who had stayed behind specifically to help restore the land. Many of them were volunteers who had come not just for the music, but for the experience of being part of something larger. Now their attention turned toward repair. Medical tents that had once been filled with visitors seeking water or rest were gradually packed away. Food stations closed one by one. The constant background hum of generators began to fade as they were shut down and removed. The farm grew quieter with each passing hour. Even the landscape itself seemed to change expression. The hillside that had once held hundreds of thousands of people now stood open again beneath the sky. Flattened grass showed where crowds had rested. Narrow paths carved by foot traffic slowly began to soften as movement decreased. In the surrounding fields, nature continued its steady rhythm. Birds returned to quieter areas of the farm. Wind moved through tall grass that had been pressed down but was beginning to rise again. The Catskill air felt lighter, no longer filled with sound carried from every direction. Local residents watched the process with a mixture of curiosity and relief. For many, the festival had been overwhelming, an unprecedented arrival of people, traffic, and activity that had transformed their normally quiet region. Now, seeing the gradual departure of visitors, they could begin to imagine their communities returning to normal. Still, there was an awareness that something unusual had occurred. Not disruptive in the way some had feared, but extraordinary in scale and spirit. As cleanup continued, conversations among workers and volunteers often turned reflective. People shared memories of the weekend in fragments, moments of kindness, unexpected music, shared meals with strangers, or simply the feeling of being part of such a large gathering without losing a sense of calm. Even exhaustion seemed to carry a certain softness. No one had experienced quite enough sleep. Few had experienced enough comfort. Yet there was little complaint. Instead, there was the quiet recognition that they had been part of something rare. By midweek, the festival grounds were largely cleared. The most visible structures had been removed or dismantled. What remained was the land itself, slowly recovering beneath the late summer sun. Grass began to stand upright again in some areas. Puddles dried into cracked patterns that would eventually fade. The farm, though changed in memory, was physically returning to what it had been. A working dairy farm. A quiet piece of countryside. A place that, for a brief moment in time, had held one of the largest gatherings in modern history. Long after the last truck left and the final pieces of equipment were removed, the hills of Bethel settled into silence again. But the memory of what had happened there did not leave so easily. It lingered in stories, in photographs, in conversations carried back across the country, and in the minds of those who had stood on that hillside, looking out at a crowd so large it seemed to blend into the landscape itself. Woodstock was over, but its presence, in a quieter way, was only just beginning. In the days after Woodstock ended, the hillside in Bethel, New York, returned to its quiet rural rhythm. Grass began to lift again where it had been pressed flat. The last traces of the festival slowly disappeared beneath the steady work of cleanup crews and the passing of time. But while the land itself grew still, the story of Woodstock was just beginning to spread. At first, it traveled in small pieces. A newspaper article here, a photograph there, a brief mention on the evening news. People across the country began to hear fragments of what had taken place on that dairy farm in upstate New York. 500,000 people, a muddy field, music echoing through the night, and an atmosphere that seemed unlike anything they had experienced before. Then the images arrived. Black and white photographs showed vast crowds stretching across rolling hills. Some captured long lines of people walking along rural roads with sleeping bags over their shoulders. Others showed musicians performing on a simple stage, while thousands of listeners sat quietly in the open air. The contrast was striking. For many who saw these images for the first time, it was difficult to fully grasp the scale of what had happened. Nothing in the recent history of popular music had looked quite like it. Television added another layer. News broadcasts replayed footage of the festival, showing aerial views of the crowd that made the gathering seem almost endless. From above, the hillside appeared as a living landscape of people, shifting gently as they moved, rested, and listened. Commentators tried to describe it. Some focused on the music. Others emphasized the traffic, the rain, or the logistical challenges. But beneath all of it, there was a shared sense that something unusual had taken place, something that could not be easily categorized as simply a concert or a gathering or a protest. It was something in between, something larger. Magazines soon followed. Full-page spreads brought color and detail to what earlier reports had only suggested. Readers could now see the mud, the makeshift shelters, the smiling faces, and the wide-open sky above the Catskills. The festival began to feel more real to those who had not been there, even as it also began to feel slightly distant, like a story being retold from memory rather than direct experience. At the same time, the music itself began to circulate in new ways. Recordings of performances were released, allowing people who had never set foot on Yaska's farm to hear what the weekend had sounded like. Albums captured select moments, preserving fragments of the festival in a form that could be played again and again. For many listeners, this was their first true connection to Woodstock. They were not experiencing the mud, the weather, or the crowds. They were experiencing the sound. And through that sound, they began to form their own understanding of what the festival had been. As weeks passed, stories from attendees also began to spread. People returned home and told friends and family what they had seen. They described the size of the crowd, the feeling of sitting on a hillside surrounded by strangers who did not feel like strangers for long, the unexpected patience during rainstorms, and the strange sense that daily rules of life had briefly softened. These personal accounts often differed in detail, but they shared a common emotional tone, a sense of calm, a sense of unity, a sense that something meaningful had occurred, even if it was difficult to fully explain. With time, these overlapping narratives began to shape a larger public memory. Woodstock became more than a festival. It became a symbol. In newspapers and conversations, it came to represent a moment when large numbers of people gathered peacefully, despite uncertainty and hardship. It was described as a rare instance of cooperation on a massive scale, where logistical chaos somehow coexisted with patience and goodwill. Of course, not every detail was perfect. Those who had been there remembered exhaustion, discomfort, and the sheer difficulty of navigating the conditions. But even those memories often softened over time, blending into a broader reflection on what had been experienced collectively. The idea of Woodstock grew larger than the event itself. It became associated with peace and idealism, with music and youth, with a moment in American history when possibilities felt briefly open and undefined. The documentary film released later that year played a major role in solidifying this image. Through extended footage, viewers could spend time inside the festival in a way that earlier news coverage could not provide. They could see long stretches of crowd life between performances, watch musicians interact with the environment, and sense the slow rhythm of the weekend unfolding. For many, this was the moment Woodstock became permanent in cultural memory, not as a single performance, but as an experience. As the years passed, Woodstock continued to be revisited in new contexts. It was referenced in discussions of music history, in conversations about festivals and large public gatherings, in Reflections on the 1960s as a period of change. Each retelling added another layer, and each layer slightly reshaped how the original event was understood. Yet beneath all of these interpretations, the core reality remained simple. It had been a few days on a farm, a temporary city of music and people, a moment that existed briefly in time and then disappeared. But because it was witnessed, recorded, and remembered so widely, it continued to live on long after the fields returned to grass. And in that way, Woodstock had already become something it never originally set out to be. Not just an event, but a lasting story carried forward by those who saw it, and even by those who did not. In the years that followed Woodstock, the farm in Bethel, New York slowly returned to its familiar rhythms. Grass grew back over the fields that had once held hundreds of thousands of people. The hills that had echoed with music and conversation became quiet again, shaped once more by wind, weather, and the steady passage of seasons. But while the land healed, the influence of Woodstock continued to spread far beyond it. It appeared first in music, then in festivals, then in the broader way people imagined what large gatherings could be. Before Woodstock, large outdoor concerts were still uncertain experiments. There were questions about safety, logistics, sound, and crowd behavior. Woodstock did not solve all of these questions perfectly, but it demonstrated something important, that massive gatherings of people could occur without descending into chaos, even under difficult conditions. That idea alone reshaped the future of live music. In the years that followed, more festivals emerged across the United States and around the world. Some were inspired directly by Woodstock. Others simply reflected the growing cultural acceptance of outdoor, multi-day musical events. Stages became larger. Sound systems became more advanced. Crowd management became more structured. Yet many of these developments traced their roots back to the lessons learned in those muddy fields in 1969. Woodstock also became part of a larger cultural memory about the 1960s themselves. It was often used as a reference point when people talked about a generation defined by change, experimentation, and a desire for something different from the past. Whether or not every detail of that memory was perfectly accurate, Woodstock became a symbol that people could return to when describing that era. A symbol of openness, a symbol of gathering, a symbol of shared experience. In conversations about music history, Woodstock is frequently mentioned alongside other turning points: the rise of electric rock, the expansion of folk music, the blending of genres that defined the late 1960s and early 1970s. But Woodstock stands apart not because it was musically unique in every detail, but because of the scale at which it brought so many different musical voices together in one place. It was not a single genre. It was many. Folk, rock, blues, soul, jazz influences, experimental sounds, all existing side by side in an open landscape. Over time, that diversity became part of its meaning. Woodstock also influenced how people thought about community, not in a strict or permanent sense, but in a temporary one. For 3 days, a vast number of strangers shared space, resources, weather, and time. They waited in lines together, walked the same muddy paths, listened to the same music, and experienced the same shifting conditions of sun and rain. That shared experience became central to how the festival was remembered. Even those who never attended began to associate Woodstock with the idea that large groups of people could, under the right conditions, coexist with patience and cooperation. In popular culture, the festival was revisited again and again, in documentaries, in anniversary events, in films, books, and interviews. Each retelling added another layer of interpretation, slowly building a version of Woodstock that was both historical and symbolic at the same time. Some remembered it as a moment of peace, others as a logistical miracle, others still as a defining musical milestone. All of these interpretations coexisted, overlapping like different memories of the same landscape viewed from slightly different angles. Eventually, the site itself became a place of reflection. Visitors came to the fields in Bethel, now marked and preserved, to stand where the stage once stood and look across the gentle slope of the land. There was no sound now except wind through grass and distant birds, but for many it was enough to simply imagine what had once filled the space. The contrast was striking, a quiet rural hillside, and beneath it the memory of a temporary city of sound. Woodstock's legacy also lives in a more subtle way, in expectation. Modern audiences attending festivals, concerts, and large outdoor events often assume a certain level of organization, safety, and infrastructure that evolved over time partly because of experiences like Woodstock. Even when conditions differ greatly, the idea that such gatherings are possible on a large scale has become normalized. But perhaps the most lasting aspect of Woodstock is not organizational or musical. It is emotional. It remains associated with a feeling that is difficult to fully describe, a sense of time stretching out, a sense of being part of something larger than oneself, a sense that, for a brief moment, ordinary life paused and people simply existed together in one shared space. That feeling cannot be preserved in photographs or recordings alone. It exists in memory, in storytelling, and in the way people pass down the idea of what happened there. And so, even as the physical traces of the festival faded from the land, Woodstock continued to exist in a different form. Not as a single event confined to August 1969, but as a story that grew over time, a story shaped by those who were there, and by those who learned about it later, a story that became part of how people imagine what is possible when large numbers of individuals gather not just for entertainment, but for shared experience under an open sky. In the weeks after Woodstock, the countryside around Bethel slowly settled into a quieter rhythm once again. The roads that had once carried endless lines of cars were now familiar and empty. The fields that had held hundreds of thousands of people returned to their usual role in the landscape, shaped by grass, cattle, and the slow movement of seasons. At first glance, it might have seemed as though everything had simply ended. A festival held, a crowd dispersed, a farm restored. But for many who had been there, the experience did not fade so easily. It lingered in small ways, in the memory of walking long distances alongside strangers who quickly felt familiar, in the sound of music carried across open fields at night, in the feeling of rain falling on thousands of people who did not leave, but stayed, waited, and shared the same uncertain weather together. Even ordinary moments from the weekend began to take on a quiet significance in hindsight. A conversation in line for water, a shared blanket during a cold evening, a stranger offering food without hesitation. None of these things were extraordinary on their own, but together they formed a pattern that people would later struggle to fully explain. For those who attended, returning to normal life was not immediate. Some went back to school. Others returned to work. Some traveled across the country, retracing long drives that now felt distant and surreal. Daily routines resumed. Clocks, schedules, responsibilities, all the structure of ordinary life returned quickly. But the memory of Woodstock existed in a different kind of time. It did not follow schedules. It appeared unexpectedly, in quiet moments, in conversations months later, in the way certain songs could suddenly bring back the feeling of that hillside in August. Even the farm itself held a kind of afterimage. Though it was physically restored, people who passed through the area in later years often described imagining what it had looked like when the land was filled with people. The contrast between memory and reality became part of its identity. a quiet field, and beneath it, a remembered city of sound. Over time, Woodstock came to represent more than just a single weekend. It became a reference point, a way of describing a moment when large numbers of people gathered without strict order, yet managed to create something that felt, to many, surprisingly peaceful. It was not perfect. It was not controlled. It was not easily repeatable. But it existed. That fact alone gave it lasting weight in cultural memory. In the years that followed, conversations about Woodstock often drifted beyond music. They touched on community, on trust between strangers, on what happens when structure loosens, even briefly, and people are left to navigate shared space together. Some remembered it as idealistic, others as chaotic but meaningful, others still as simply a long, unusual weekend that happened to take place at the right moment in time. All of these interpretations coexisted. None fully captured it, and perhaps none needed to, because part of Woodstock's lasting presence is that it resists a single definition. It remains something slightly out of reach, not because it is forgotten, but because it is remembered in too many ways at once. For Max Jaska's farm, the transformation was temporary in a physical sense, but permanent in a historical one. The land itself did not change its shape forever, but its meaning expanded. A working dairy farm became, for a brief moment, the center of something much larger than itself, and that contrast, between the ordinary and the extraordinary, became one of the quiet themes of the story. In the end, Woodstock was not preserved as a permanent place in the physical world. It could not be. It existed for a few days, and then it passed. But what remained was something different. A set of images, a collection of sounds, a shared memory carried forward by those who were there, and those who learned about it later through stories, recordings, and films. And perhaps most importantly, a feeling that continued to resurface whenever people imagined what it might look like when large numbers of strangers come together, not as a crowd, but as something closer to a temporary community. Not defined by permanence, not defined by perfection, but defined, briefly, by presence. And in that brief presence, Woodstock left behind something that would continue to echo long after the last tent was packed away and the last road out of Bethel finally cleared. A reminder that sometimes, even for a short time, people can share the same space, and make it feel a little more connected than it was before. In the end, Woodstock was never just one thing. It was a music festival. It was a logistical challenge. It was a gathering of strangers on a summer hillside in upstate New York. But more than anything else, it was a brief moment in time when something large and unplanned became, for a short while, strangely harmonious. When the last trucks finally left Bethel and the final tents were taken down, there was nothing dramatic that marked the transition back to normal life. No final announcement echoed across the fields. No ceremony closed the weekend. Instead, there was only quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives gradually, after noise has stretched on long enough that its absence feels unfamiliar at first. Max Jaska's farm returned to its familiar shape. Grass lifted slowly where it had been pressed flat. The hills regained their calm contours, and the wind moved across the fields the same way it always had, as if nothing extraordinary had interrupted it at all. But of course, something had, because even though the land returned to normal, the memory of what happened there did not. It remained in photographs, in recordings, in the stories told by those who had been there, and even in the curiosity of those who had not. Over time, Woodstock became more than a place or an event. It became a reference point for something larger, a reminder that, under unusual circumstances, large numbers of people can come together without losing their sense of patience or shared space. that music can act as a common language, and that even temporary communities can leave behind lasting impressions. For those who stood on that hillside, the memory often returns not as a single image, but as a collection of sensations. The weight of warm air in the afternoon, the sound of rain on canvas and skin, the distant glow of stage lights at night, the slow movement of crowds that never felt entirely like crowds, and the feeling difficult to define but easy to remember, of simply being there among others who were also just there. Not arriving, not leaving, just present. Woodstock did not solve the world's problems. It did not last long enough to become a permanent way of life, and it was never as simple or as perfect as it is sometimes remembered to be. But it did happen, and because it happened, it left behind something that continued to ripple outward long after the music stopped. In the decades that followed, its name would be repeated often, in conversations about music, in discussions about culture, in reflections on moments when people gather in large numbers and briefly feel part of something shared. But the true essence of Woodstock is not found in its scale, or its headlines, or even its most famous performances. It is found in the quieter spaces in between, in the long waits, in the muddy paths, in the shared silence between songs, in the simple act of strangers existing side by side without needing to be anything more than present. And perhaps that is why it continues to be remembered, not because it was flawless, but because, for a few days on a dairy farm in 1969, something unfolded that felt, at least to those who experienced it, like a small glimpse of what gathering together could be. And when it ended, nothing remained except the land, the memories, and the music carried forward in people's minds. The fields went quiet again. The crowds went home. The stage was taken down. But the story did not disappear. It simply changed form, from something that happened into something that was remembered. And in that remembering, Woodstock continued, softly, endlessly, like the fading echo of a song that never quite leaves the air. Good night.